Welcome back, A and P, for another lecture. This time we're going to be continuing on with our dive into the digestive system and looking at some of the major nutrients that we absorb as part of the process, specifically the ones known as macromolecules or biomolecules. So macromolecules describe kind of an umbrella term for the major types of nutrients that we get from our food. Macromolecules are what is known as organic compounds. This does not mean that they cost extra at the grocery store and you can find a whole bunch of them at Whole Foods. What it does mean is that these are compounds that chemists refer to that have a lot of carbon in them. So carbon is kind of the main compound that supports life and organisms here on Earth. And so that's why chemists call compounds that have a lot of carbon in them organic compounds. So these macromolecules are really large organic molecules. They're big molecules, hence the macro in their name. And they are made out of a lot of carbon. So these macromolecules are big carbon-based molecules. So cells are the different parts of our body, the tiny little cells inside of our body that make everything run. And our body is built out of cells, but cells are built out of smaller building blocks called macromolecules. So there are four major groups of macromolecules that we are going to be talking about today that you need to know a little bit about. They are the lipids, the carbohydrates, the proteins, and the nucleic acid. All these four guys together consist of the major groups of nutrients that we get when we eat and digest material and food. So before we get into the specifics of these different macromolecules and what exactly they do for our body, there are some basics that we have to cover first. And the first one is how these macromolecules are structured. They aren't just one big, overly complicated structure. They're actually a big structure made up of smaller structures. The name of the big structure is a polymer, and the smaller structures that make it up are monomers. So macromolecules are made up of these smaller subunits or these smaller building blocks. And each individual subunit, each little piece is called a monomer. So mono is the scientific prefix relating to one or single. So like if you're married to somebody, you're in a monogamous relationship, meaning that you are with one other person only. That's what mono refers to. And so monomer refers to one single subunit. If you take a whole bunch of monomers and put them all together, you get what's called a polymer. So poly in science, again, relates to multiple or many. Some people in certain religions or organizations are in polygamous relationships where they have multiple different boyfriends, girlfriends, and partners all in one overall relationship. And so these polymers are when we have multiple monomers, multiple single pieces that basically just all get stacked up together into one larger structure. So if we have this little basic chain right down here, this guy would be our polymer because it is a whole bunch of different subunits stacked together, but each subunit on its own is a monomer. Each individual little piece is a monomer, and then when we link a whole bunch of monomers together, we get our polymer. So a monomer is just the one single unit. Like these guys are here, they're just one single individual units. And then polymer is our big overall chain of multiple units. So how is it that we make these macromolecules? What's kind of the process behind creating these big strings of monomers? Well, actually, it's surprisingly easy. It's through a process called dehydration synthesis. So in science, synthesis is just a fancy word for making stuff. And as you might know, dehydration relates to a lack of water or losing water. If somebody is really sick and really dehydrated, that means they are losing a lot of water. They don't have a lot of water. And so dehydration synthesis is losing water in order to make something. In this case, in order to make a macromolecule. So we form these big structures, these polymers, by sticking these monomers together by what's known as removing water. So if we have these H and OH groups on the ends of our monomers, our individual little pieces, then when we want to stick these monomers together, we can pull away this H and this OH. We have 1, 2 H's and 1 O. And as you might know from other science classes, H2O is the scientific formula for water. So if we take these H's and O's, pull them away from this growing chain right here and this single monomer right here, then all of a sudden, these guys aren't here anymore. And now our chains need something to hook onto at the end of their structure. So they hook on to each other. So when we take away this water, then the monomer and the polymer will bind together. What about if we want to separate them? What if we have a big structure, a big polymer, and we want to break it down into smaller and smaller pieces? Well, the way that we do that is the exact opposite of this path we were just talking about. So hydrolysis is the name of the chemical reaction that happens. Lysis is a fancy scientific term meaning to break or kill something. And hydro relates to water. And so in a hydrolysis reaction, we break the bonds between monomers by adding water. So with dehydration synthesis before, we were taking away the water, causing the monomers to bind together. In hydrolysis, we have monomers that are bound together right here. We're going to add an H2O molecule, a water molecule, in there. And when we do that, instead of being bound together, now they're going to bind to different pieces of that water molecule. And we're going to end up with one H attaching to one side and an H and an O attaching to the other side. So we're separating the monomers by adding a water molecule at one of these bonds, which causes that bond to break, attach to the water instead, and separate these polymers. So instead of having a group of 3, we now have a group of 2 and a single monomer over on the side. So we build polymers with this dehydration synthesis, combining stuff together. And we break polymers by hydrolysis, adding in water and forcing the molecule apart. So what you need to know for each one of the major macromolecules that we're about to talk about is 3 different things. The names of the 4 macromolecules, 4 different things. First off, the names of the 4 macromolecules, what are they called? What's their overall structure called? the names of each monomer for the macromolecule. So each separate macromolecule will have its own monomer that goes with it. Make sure you know the names of those. The function of the macromolecule, what does our body use carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids for? And then finally, the food source of the macromolecule. What kind of foods are going to have really high concentrations of these structures? And the reason that you need to know this is because your homework that goes along with these notes is this macromolecule chart right here. And so for each macromolecule, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, you have to write down the name of the monomer, its function in the body, and some examples of food and other food products that this macromolecule comes in. So with that, let's get started with our first group of macromolecules, the carbohydrates. So these are one of my personal favorites. You probably know them as carbs. So whenever people talk about carbs or are referring to carbs in food, they're talking about carbohydrates. So carbohydrates, the monomer of the carbohydrate is a structure called a simple sugar, or in more sciencey terms, it's called a monosaccharide. So saccharide is science for sugar, and mono is, again, relates to just one single piece. So the cool thing about carbohydrates is that their monomers, the simple sugars, are rings. So there are these rings of carbons with some oxygens and some hydrogens filled in. So glucose, which is a very, very common sugar in nature, is a monosaccharide. One single ring means one single monomer. The polymer, or the actual full structure of the carbohydrate, is when you have a complex carbohydrate. So you don't have a simple sugar anymore. You have complex carbohydrates. And this just means that you have lots of sugars, lots of simple sugars, rings bonded together to make a big long chain. And so in this case, we have a chain of 4 monosaccharides, 4 monomers put together to create this larger polymer. So the monomer is a simple sugar. You put a whole bunch of these together to make a big chain of complex carbohydrates. So the primary function of carbohydrates in our body, what our body mainly uses carbs for, is energy. These guys are the major energy source of our cells. So as we eat carbohydrates, like say a complex carb like starch, like in pasta or bread or potatoes, it comes in this big long chunk of rings, right? Lots and lots and lots of rings all together. As you eat and digest those rings, you'll break it down into smaller and smaller pieces until eventually you end up with just single simple sugars. These simple sugars are then what gets carried from your digestive system to your cells, and your cells use these simple sugars to create energy. So there's different kind of levels of energy that we can get depending on the carbohydrates that we eat. If we eat something with a lot of simple sugars in it, so something like a candy bar, for example, just like if you give kids too much sugar, they'll get a short burst of energy and be crazy for a little bit. And then what do? They crash, because all that energy is so simple that the cells get it and use it really quickly and then run out of energy very quickly as well. So they just get a short burst of energy. Something with these really long chains of energy, like a more complex carb like a starch, they take longer to digest. It's kind of a more slow release of energy. So you get a more sustained amount of energy over the course of time. It's not as much of just a short burst. Not all carbohydrates are able to be broken down by us. We essentially have to have the right types of cellular machinery in order to break these bonds apart between the different rings. Some carbohydrates, like the cellulose that's in leaves and grass and other plant parts, we physically cannot break that down as humans. If it goes into our stomach, it's coming out the other end, basically the same as when it went in. We do not have the ability to break down things like leaves and grass. That's why if you ever try to go be like a survivalist and live in the woods on your own and just eat leaves and grass to survive, you're gonna have a bad time. There are animals like deer, cows, sheep, horses that are able to survive off these leaves and grass. They do have the right cellular machinery in order to break down the bonds between cellulose. We can't do that, so we just pass it right out the other end as fiber. So, what types of food do carbohydrates come in? Lots and lots and lots of different types. But it also depends on if you're talking about simple carbs or complex carbs. Simple carbs are essentially different types of basic sugar. So they're found not only in things like candy and soda that you would expect, but also fruit and vegetables have a lot of simple carbs as well. Again, these are easy to digest and they give you a short burst of energy. More complex carbs come in the form of starch. These are things that you find in bread, pasta, potatoes, stuff like that. Excuse me. So it takes a longer amount of time to break down, and they provide a longer, kind of more sustained release of energy. So carbs are our energy source. They're made up of simple sugars, and we can get the simple versions of them in things like candy and fruit, and the more complex starchy versions from pasta and bread. Up next, we have lipids. So the macromolecule lipids, what it really refers to, when you see the word lipids, I want you to think fat. That's essentially what lipids are. Lipids are forms of fat. So lipids are fats, and they're made up of these structures called fatty acids. So there are these big, long chains of carbons. We're not doing rings anymore. Rings was for the carbohydrates. We're past that. Lipids are these big, long chains, these big strings, with this little CO group up at the top. So if we take these fatty acids and put a whole bunch of them together into a multiple part chain, that's when we get our polymer called lipids. So lipids are made of a whole bunch of fatty acids put together. It might be 2, it might be 3, it might be 10, 15, 18, but they're all together as part of this larger lipid structure. So lipids are made out of a monomer of fatty acids. So these lipids, like I said, come in these big long chains. They can be saturated, which is this guy over here, where the chain is pretty much one long, straight, continuous chain. That's due to all of these little single bonds between the different carbons in the chain right here. Remember, macromolecules are organic molecules, so they're mostly made out of carbon. Unsaturated fatty acids are the ones that have this weird bend in the chain, and that bend comes from this double bond between two carbons right here. We're not going to go super into detail on why you have single versus double bonds. It just shows us the difference between the two major groups of lipids. Saturated fats have this one big long chain with all single bonds. Unsaturated fats have 2 or fewer multiple chains that are connected with this double bond right here instead of a single bond. The top of the lipid and the bottom of the lipid also have some different properties. So this part and this part have some different properties as well. The bottom part down here, this big long chain, is what's known as hydrophobic, meaning that it does not mix well with water. So that's why if you ever have like some oil left over in your cooking pan and you put some water in there to clean it out, you don't really see the mix at all. You just see the oil all kind of blob up and float around on the top of the water. That's because oil is basically all fat and lipids, and these big tails down here do not play well with water. They want to stay away from water. So lipids actually have a couple major functions in our body and in our cells. The most important one is that lipids make up the membrane of our cells. So here is kind of a basic drawing of a cell. You have the outside of the cell and inside of the cell. And the exterior environment, the outside and the inside, are separated by this layer of lipids running all the way around the cell. So these lipids cover the cell in this membrane, give the cell a certain structure, and also play an important role of keeping the outside stuff outside of the cell and the inside stuff inside of the cell. It's bad for the cell if the outside and inside just goes in and out willy-nilly. So this lipid bilayer acts sort of as a barrier, a wall between the outside and inside of the cell to make sure that the cell is only letting out and letting in stuff that it wants to. Another useful thing with lipids is that we can also use them as long-term energy storage. So the reason why people or animals will get fat deposits around their body if they eat too many calories, too much food, especially too much fatty food, is that if we have so many carbon molecules available to turn into energy that we don't really need them right now. We take in so much energy, but we don't need that much energy over the course of the day. Our body doesn't want to just waste that energy and get rid of it. Instead, our body will turn it into lipids and store it as fat around our body. And so when people put on weight because they're gaining a lot of fat, that's essentially what's happening, is that our body is taking all the excess energy from the food we eat, turning it into lipids so that in case in the future we don't have quite enough food to eat, we can start breaking down these lipids and turning them into energy. It doesn't work quite as well as the carbohydrates that we talked about earlier, so that's why our body doesn't do it for everything that we eat. But if we eat too much, it'll get turned into fat and stored until we don't eat enough and then get burned off for energy. Another really important function of lipids, especially for organisms that live in really cold environments, is that they're really good at insulating. So all humans, no matter how fit you are, have a really thin layer of lipids underneath your skin that helps to keep your body heat inside of your body. Some animals like seals, penguins, polar bears that live in really northern or really southern areas of the world, they have a really thick layer of lipids called blubber that helps them retain a lot of their body heat, so that even if they're like a penguin swimming in 30-degree water, their internal body temperature is able to stay relatively warm because they have this thick layer of fat covering and insulating their body. So as you might imagine, based on the fact that lipids are essentially fat, you get lipids from eating very fatty foods. So things like meat, especially red meat, like hamburger, steak, bacon, stuff like that, very, very high in fat content. Some fish like salmon and tuna has a relatively high fat content. Oils like olive oil, canola oil, avocado oil, these guys are basically just straight lipids. So we use them because they transfer heat really well to the food and they add a little bit extra fatty flavor to our food. But that's essentially what they are, is that they're just liquefied versions of lipids. Avocados have a fairly high amount of fat content for a fruit, especially. And then eggs and nuts also have some fat in there as well. So lipids, we get them from fatty food. They're made up of fatty acid, and we use them in order to protect the cell membrane, to store energy over a long period of time, and to help insulate our bodies from the cold outside temperature. Our third and one of the most major macromolecules that we have in our body are proteins. So proteins are made up of smaller monomers called amino acids. So there are 20 different kinds of amino acids that exist in nature that build all of the different proteins that our body uses. So when we take these amino acids, we basically take them and put them in a big long string like this. And so each one of these is an amino acid that's connected to another one. And so as these amino acids get added on to the string, eventually we'll get a full structure that gets folded up and turned into a protein. So our monomers are amino acids. We take those amino acids, string them together, fold them all up, and we get a protein. So here are the 20 different amino acids that exist. Obviously, you do not have to know anything specific about these amino acids, unless at some point in the future you're like Mr. Stanley and you have to take a biochemistry class in college, in which case you have to memorize the structure and the name of every single one of these amino acids. Yeah, it's a really fun time. You're going to love it. But so all these different amino acids, we can put them together in all sorts of different combinations and make thousands and thousands and thousands of different proteins. So depending on the types of amino acids that we put together, and depending on how the protein gets folded up, this will determine what the protein does. So the shape of a protein determines what kind of role that protein is going to play in the cell. You don't have to know anything about how we shape the proteins or kind of like the process that goes through it, which is what all this stuff is about. Don't worry so much about that stuff. But know that the shape of a protein determines its function. What kind of shape that a protein gets folded into, that is what's going to determine what role that protein will play in our bodies. So these proteins do hundreds of different jobs in our body, but we're only going to focus on two of the major things that they do for us. One of the things that they do is they help to build and repair different tissues around the body, especially in the muscle. Our muscle is basically made out of protein. And so the reason why you see people who are really focused on like bulking up and getting really big muscles and getting really strong, really focused in on the protein that they eat and drink, is because if you want to grow large muscles, you need a lot of protein there to be able to repair and build new muscle tissue. So whenever you work out and go through a really strenuous exercise, the reason that you feel so sore afterwards is that you've actually caused tons of tiny little tears in the muscle fiber of the muscles you were working on. Luckily, your protein comes in, and not only do proteins repair the muscle that was broken, but they also add on some extra layers of muscle so that it's less likely to get damaged in the future. And that's how people are able to build up muscle in their body over time, is by doing hundreds of cycles of working out, causing damage, getting extra muscle added on, working out that muscle, causing it to get damaged, getting muscle added on and so forth. So that's one of our first main functions of proteins. Our other one is something that we actually talked about a little bit earlier in the week with our digestive system and our stomach, and that is enzymes. So I mentioned in the digestive system that enzymes are what help to break down all sorts of different food and nutrients and these macromolecules that we bring into our bodies. They're mostly broken down by enzymes. And the way that enzymes do that is that they are specialized proteins that speed up the rate of chemical reactions. So they help the breakdown of the food that we eat go much, much, much faster than if we just let it sit in our stomach for hours and hours and hours. So essentially what happens is that we'll eat some sort of food. It'll go into our stomach as what's called a substrate. So that's this little piece. And then this guy is our enzyme right here. The enzyme will bind to the substrate, so they're will join up with one another. And it'll cause a chemical reaction to happen. In this case, it's causing a reaction that breaks that big substrate into smaller pieces. It then releases those smaller pieces and is ready to bind and go through this process with another substrate all over again. So these enzymes are specialized proteins that speed up chemical reactions, and in terms of digestion, they break down our big polymers into those smaller monomers. So we get protein from things like meat, from animals and fish, because meat is essentially just a ton of protein all condensed down together. It's all muscle that we're eating. Nuts and milk have a pretty good amount of protein in them. Eggs are pretty good sources of protein. So you see people who are really interested in like fitness and bodybuilding eating a lot of eggs to try and get their protein in. And then soy, so stuff like tofu, is also a good source of protein, especially for people who are vegetarian or vegan and aren't eating this meat and fish. Soy and tofu, for a plant-based product, has a pretty high amount of protein that they can use in order to get the amount of protein that their body needs. Another really important aspect to eating different sources of protein is that I mentioned earlier that there are 20 different amino acids that our human body needs. We, inside of our body and our cells, can only make 14 of the 20. That means there are 6 amino acids that we cannot make. We have to get it from eating other organisms that have these amino acids as part of their proteins inside of them. So in order to make our own proteins, we need the amino acids from other organisms in order to get the building blocks for the proteins for our cells. So proteins are made out of amino acids that we get from eating things like meat, fish, milk, soy, stuff like that. And we use them for tons of different things, but especially for building and repairing tissues in our body, and also for acting as enzymes to speed up chemical reactions and help us break down the food that we eat. Finally, our fourth and last macromolecule are the nucleic acids. These guys you probably have heard of before, but you just didn't realize it. So nucleic acids are made up of bases or monomers called nucleotides. So nucleotide is a phosphate group over here. This 5-carbon sugar, because again, we're an organic molecule, so we're going to have lots of carbon in there. And then one of 4 different bases. So we have 4 different possible bases that's represented by this big square up here. If we put thousands and millions of these nucleotides together, we get nucleic acids. Specifically, a type of nucleic acid you've probably heard of before is DNA. So the DNA that's inside of your body that contains like your genes and your traits, this is an amino or a nucleic acid. And it's built so each one of these little colored kind of like rungs or steps right here is a different nucleotide. So your DNA is made up of millions and millions of these nucleotides, all connected to one another and all twirling around each other in what's called this double helix pattern. There's another type of nucleic acid called RNA. That's this guy down here, which is very, very similar to DNA, but instead of having these 2 strands wrapped around each other, it just has the 1 strand kind of looping around itself. But DNA and RNA are nucleic acids, and they're made out of nucleotides. So the reason why nucleic acids are so important is that they contain your genetic information. So the genes, the information that you inherit from your parents that determines your hair color, your eye color, your earlobe shape, the style of your thumb, whether or not you have a cleft chin or a widow's peak in your hair, how tall that you're going to be, if you're going to be resistant or susceptible to different types of diseases. All of that information is stored in your DNA. So basically the DNA, the nucleic acids, are like the blueprint for how to build the rest of your body and how to keep your body going on a regular basis. All that information is stored in DNA, and DNA is a type of nucleic acid. So nucleic acids are all about storing and transmitting these genes, this genetic information that tells the rest of your body and the rest of your cells how to function. Luckily, getting nucleic acids from your food is very simple because everything that we eat, for the most part, was alive at some point, either was an animal or a plant. Every single cell in every single animal and plant has DNA inside of it. All of your cells have DNA. All of your dogs or cat cells have DNA. All of the cells of the cow or the broccoli or the pig or the apple that you ate, all of them have DNA inside of them. So basically all of the food that you eat that's based on animals and plants is going to have nucleic acids inside of it. So basically anything that has some nutritional value. Obviously, things that humans create that are based just a bunch of like sugar connected to each other, that's not really going to have a lot of nucleic acids in it, right? So soda, candy bars, sugar, stuff like that, that's not really going to have a lot of nucleic acid. It has to be something based on animals or plants. But there's not really any specific type of animal and plant. They all are based on DNA, and so we can get nucleic acids and nucleotides from all of them. So those are our 4 major groups of macromolecules: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So the final thing that we're going to talk about is how we take these big polymers that are in our food and turn that into big polymers that are stored inside of our body. And we partially talked about how to do that earlier this week through the process of digestion. So when we eat food, when you eat a hamburger and you're chewing through all of the beef and the bread and the tomato and the lettuce and the condiments that are on there, they go through your digestive system that we were talking about earlier this week, right? Your mouth, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, mixing around with all the stuff from the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. And all of that digestion, the reason that it's there is to take these big macromolecules and break them down into their monomers. So we don't send lipids or proteins or carbohydrates directly to our cells after we eat them. Instead, we turn them into fatty acids and amino acids and simple sugars. Those are what gets sent to our cells. So imagine that you buy like this nice plot of land that you're planning on building your dream home on, and there's this brick building that the outside looks like it's in pretty good shape. All the bricks look pretty nice, but the inside is just a complete dumpster fire. There's trash and infestation and gross stuff all around. So you decide that you're gonna take apart the building brick by brick, get rid of all the stuff that you don't want, but hold on to all the bricks. So you kind of tear it apart piece by piece. We send all those pieces, all of these monomers, into our cells, and our cells are what then put them and construct them back together and turn all those fatty acids into lipids. They turn all of those simple sugars into energy, into carbohydrates. They turn all of those different nucleotides into new DNA and RNA, new nucleic acids. So we reconstruct these monomers into the larger macromolecules that we need. So this would be like using all these old bricks that we took off of the old building and then building a new building and putting the bricks back together on top of that. So now it's in a new shape that we like a lot better, it's a lot safer, and it's a lot cleaner, but we use the bricks that we got from the old building. That's essentially what's happening through digestion and reconstruction, is we take our big macromolecules that we get in the food, we break them down in digestion and absorb them through the small intestine and large intestine and send them to our cells. Our cells then build them back up in a form that's more useful for our human body and not based on the cow or chicken or broccoli cells that we ate a couple hours earlier. So if we take these carbohydrates, we break them down in the stomach and intestines into simple sugars. We eat these lipids, we break them down into fatty acids. We eat these proteins, we break them down into amino acids, and we eat these nucleic acids and break them down into nucleotides. These monomers are, after they're broken down in the stomach, these are what go to the cells, and our cells rebuild them into the lipids, the proteins, the carbohydrates, and the nucleic acids that our human cells need. So that is a summary of our macromolecules. Remember, for your homework, you're going to want to take this information and write it down in this macromolecules chart down here. Again, you can either build this chart on your own piece of paper and fill it in there, or if you want to write on this chart directly and upload it onto the Google Classroom or send it to me in a text message or email, however works for you, just again, make sure that your answers and the things that you're writing down in the chart on your own paper or wherever you're writing it clearly match up with kind of the different spaces, so that it's very clear for me to read and be able to know, okay, yeah, this one goes with that one, this one goes with that one, so on and so forth. Hopefully that helped you understand a little bit more about the different macromolecules and how our body uses them for different functions. Again, if you ever have any questions about this or anything else that we've talked about in anatomy and physiology so far, you can always come to one of our Zoom office hours and ask me face-to-face. You can send me a text to my work phone or send an email to my michael.stanley@excelcenterhighschool.org email. I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as possible with the best explanation that I can make. So hopefully that, sorry, my mind just totally went blank there for a second, of course, right at the very end of the video. But if you have any other questions, let me know. And if not, then I will see you back here in a week for our next set of notes and lectures.